Ensign David Mercer stood at the edge of the Grand Salari banquet hall, his formal navy blue uniform feeling stiff and too tight around the collar, though he doubted anyone here noticed or cared least of all the towering, jewel-clad aliens seated around the massive crystalline tables. The ceiling stretched high above like a sky of frozen starlight, and Zilari nobles floated in conversation, their elongated forms wrapped in shimmering fabrics that moved like smoke. It was Earth's first official diplomatic contact with the Zilari Empire, and David, a low-ranking communications officer, had only been brought along as an emergency replacement when a senior envoy fell ill. He wasn't meant to speak, let alone be seen, but somehow, through the chaos of unfamiliar rituals and translation errors, he found himself standing across from Princess Ayara, heir to the Empire, her tall, elegant figure framed by an arch of bioluminescent flowers that pulsed with her breathing. David, sweating under the gaze of hundreds, had nothing to offer. No grand speech, no official gift. Just a quiet panic and an awkward sense that he had made a mistake by walking into the wrong line. Still, the princess looked at him, those glowing, violet eyes unreadable, and he remembered the small wooden rose in his pocket, a thing he had carved from a scrap of ship panel during long hours of boredom in space. It was nothing, really, just a hobby, something he used to do back on Earth while watching the sun set through his grandparents' window. He reached into his uniform and pulled it out slowly, hoping it wouldn't be taken as a threat. The Juin rose was simple, sanded smooth, its petals uneven but shaped with care. He stepped forward, swallowed his fear, and offered it to her with both hands. "It's just a flower," he said quietly. From Earth, Ayara's expression didn't change. For a moment, no one moved. The hall went still, like someone had muted the entire room. Then, without a word, the princess reached out and took the carving. Her fingers, long, glowing, and elegant, closed around the wood with great care, as if it were something fragile. Her lips parted slightly and her eyes widened just a fraction, but it was enough. Around the room, the Silari nobles gasped. Not loud, not dramatic, but in unison a sudden, sharp breath that sliced the silence. David blinked, unsure of what had just happened. A whisper began to rise through the room like a ripple, words in Silari that his translator implant couldn't quite catch. One of the senior Earth diplomats at the edge of the room stumbled forward, pale and sweating, whispering into a comlink. Ayara turned to face her counsel, then looked back at David, and in a voice that rang with surprising clarity, she said something that echoed off the crystalline walls. The translator crackled to life. "He offers his soul." David's heart skipped. That was definitely not what he meant. Another Zilari stepped forward, a figure in dark robes with a staff that pulsed with light, and bowed deeply to the princess, before nodding at David with reverence. The tension in the room was thick enough to crush metal. The diplomat nearest David whispered frantically, "You gave her a hand-carved gift. Do you have any idea what that means here?" David shook his head. "No, it's a flower. I made it by hand. That's all." The diplomat's face paled even more. "Exactly. They only carve wood for sacred vows. Family, legacy, sometimes love." David's eyes widened. "I didn't mean..." But the princess was already moving, holding the rose in both hands like a treasure. Her voice rang out again. The translator hesitated, then translated, "The tradition is remembered. The bond is acknowledged." Before David could ask what that meant, a loud chime echoed through the room, and guards stepped forward not to seize him, but to escort him with care toward the royal dais. Every Zelari in the room bowed as he passed, their eyes glowing with something between awe and confusion. David followed, stunned, as the princess turned to him and offered her hand, an invitation, not a command. He took it, unsure, and as they stepped up to the higher platform, he saw the stars above begin to shift in the transparent ceiling shaped by Zelari technology into a swirling constellation, and at its center a single blooming rose. The whispering grew louder behind them, and David could make out the phrase repeating, even without translation, "The gift returns, the promise stirs." David didn't know what promise they meant. He didn't know why something so small had changed the room so completely. But as Ayara held the rose close to her chest and smiled, not a political smile, but something warmer, deeper, he realized one thing very clearly. This was no longer a diplomatic banquet. This was the start of something far bigger than he could understand, and whatever it was, he had just become a part of it. David Mercer had barely slept since the banquet, his mind spinning with questions and confusion as the Zelari ship glided silently through space, its walls glowing faintly with soft, shifting lights like living crystal. The small wooden rose he had carved was now locked away inside a golden case guarded by elite warriors who had not spoken a single word to him since he handed it over to Princess Ayara. Everyone on the Earth delegation had looked at him differently. After the incident, some with awe, others with panic, and his commanding officer had warned him in a low voice, "Tread carefully. You may have just become the most important or dangerous human in the galaxy." Now, standing outside the private chamber of the Zelari heir herself, David felt like a child about to face a storm. Two towering guards, faces hidden behind shimmering helmets, opened the door without a word, and he stepped inside, heart pounding. The room was silent and vast, filled with floating orbs of light and strands of glowing fabric that twisted in the air like windless flags. In the center, Princess Ayara sat on a raised platform, dressed in flowing silver robes, the wooden rose resting beside her on a cushion of soft blue light. She looked up, and her eyes, those strange, deep violet eyes, met his. "You came," she said softly, her voice smooth and calm. David nodded, unable to think of anything clever or diplomatic. He was just a soldier, not trained for this, but the way she looked at him wasn't like a ruler addressing a visitor. It was something else, something personal. She stood slowly and motioned for him to join her. As he stepped onto the platform, the air grew warmer and the lights shifted color. "Do you know what your gift means?" she asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. David shook his head. "Not really. I just made it because I thought it was nice. Something from home, something real." She studied him in silence, then nodded slowly. "The Zelari lost the art of woodcraft centuries ago. We now use only synthetic matter. But carved wood, real wood, was once reserved for soul bonds, for promises that outlived time. When you gave me that rose, it was not just a gift. It was a message, whether you meant it or not." David blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. "I didn't know. I never meant to disrespect your customs." Ayara smiled gently. "You did not disrespect them. You revived them." Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the strange energy that seemed to radiate from her skin. "I want to show you something," she said. She turned, and a hidden panel in the wall slid open, revealing a long corridor lined with glowing symbols. "Follow me." David hesitated only for a second before walking behind her, past guards who didn't even glance at him. The corridor led to a wide circular room filled with floating images, ancient carvings, and holographic memories preserved from the beginning of the Empire. "This is the Hall of Echoes," she said. "Only the ruling family may enter. And now you." David was stunned. "Why me?" Ayara touched one of the carvings, and it shimmered into motion an image of a distant planet, a garden blooming in light, and a figure offering a carved rose to a royal woman who looked very much like Ayara. "This happened 10,000 cycles ago. A visitor from another star gave our ancestor a rose, a real rose, and with it came a promise to protect beauty and meaning in a galaxy that was losing both." The image faded. "We called it a legend," she continued, "but your gift matches the story exactly. Some believe it is fate, others fear it." David swallowed hard. "So what happens now?" Ayara turned to him, her eyes unreadable. "Now you must speak to the council." David's stomach dropped. "Why? I'm no leader." "Because," she said, "they need to know that not all gifts come with weapons, that not all visitors want power, and because you've become something we cannot explain but cannot ignore." Hours later, he stood in a grand hall surrounded by tall Zelari lords and scholars, all watching him with expressions of confusion, interest, and caution. Ayara stood beside him as he spoke, his voice shaking but honest. He told them why he carved the rose, what it meant to humans to give something made with time and care, and how he had no plan, only goodwill. The council whispered among themselves. Some nodded, others frowned. One ancient lord stood and asked, "Are you a symbol or a mistake?" David didn't know how to answer, but Ayara spoke before he could. "He is both, as are we all, but symbols can change the world." After the meeting, David expected to be sent back to his ship. Instead, a message came directly from Ayara. "You are now my chosen witness." He didn't know what that meant, but the honor shook the very heart of the Empire. That night, as stars wheeled silently outside his guest chamber, he looked. At the pendant Ayara had left for him, a tiny crystal with a sliver of carved wood inside, and realized the galaxy was watching his every move. Somewhere deep inside, something stirred. Not fear, but something stronger, the sense that this was only the beginning. David woke to the sound of music that wasn't music, a soft hum in the air like distant voices singing from inside the walls, and for a moment he thought he was dreaming again. But when he opened his eyes, the crystal pendant left by Princess Ayara still hung beside his bed, gently glowing with a pale blue light. And he remembered everything: the banquet, the carved wooden rose, the council, and the impossible title he had been given, chosen witness. He didn't even know what it meant, but the Zelari did, and they were watching him like he was a living legend or a warning. He dressed quickly in the soft ceremonial robe they'd given him, the Earth uniform folded neatly beside his bed as a quiet reminder of the world he had come from. As he stepped into the hallway, 2 guards were waiting, tall and silent, their armor shifting colors like sunlight on water. One of them handed him a message plate, and as he held it, Ayara's voice spoke from within. "I invite you to the sanctum of the air. No outsider has entered in 500 cycles. Come and learn what has been hidden." The guards began walking without waiting, and David followed, heart racing, unsure if this was honor or trap, or maybe both. They moved through tunnels of light and stone, past rooms filled with glowing plants and floating crystals, until finally they came to a massive circular door, covered in carvings that pulsed with life. It opened without sound, and the air beyond felt different, heavier, quieter, almost sacred. Inside, the chamber was vast and round, its walls lined with relics and symbols, some made of metal, some of wood so ancient it looked like stone. In the center stood Ayara, dressed in a cloak of silver leaves, her face calm but serious. "You are now part of something old," she said, her voice low. "Something most Xelari no longer believe in. This sanctum holds the memory of our true beginning, not the stories told in court, but the truth of who we were." She led him to a carved table where a large book lay open, not electronic, but real, made of thin, fragile pages. "This," she said, "is the record of the bond. It speaks of a visitor from another world, long before our empire became what it is now. He brought a gift made not for power, but for meaning. A gift like yours." David leaned in, reading the ancient script as it translated slowly in his implant. The story was nearly the same as what Ayara had shown him before a stranger, from the stars, a carved flower, a promise of unity, but there were more details here, darker ones. The first empress had tried to keep the gift, but her court feared its meaning. A war had nearly broken out, not between worlds, but between ideas. They feared the gift because it reminded them of what they had lost, Ayara said softly. Emotion, connection, things that power cannot control. She turned to him. "You have reawakened that memory." David took a deep breath, trying to understand. "So what now? What do you want from me?" She stepped closer. "The people believe your gift is the sign foretold, that the one who brings the soul-carved bloom will stand beside the air during the renewal. That is only days away." "Renewal?" he asked. "Every 1,000 cycles the heir of the empire must stand in the core forge and renew the vow of purpose. It is tradition, but this time it may be more." She looked at him, eyes fierce now. "You will stand with me, not as a guest, as part of the vow." David felt the floor shift beneath his feet, not physically, but inside his mind, as if everything he thought was real had just changed. "I'm just a communications officer," he said. "I don't know your laws, your customs, and that is why it must be you," Ayara said, "because you gave without knowing, without calculation. The court does not understand that, but the people, they will." Before he could respond, a warning chime echoed through the chamber, and a Xelari aide rushed in, eyes wide. "My lady, urgent transmission from the border systems. The Rakjun have moved their fleets into formation." Ayara's expression turned to steel. "They move because they sense division. They smell fear." She looked back at David. "Then there is no more time. Come with me." He followed her out of the sanctum, back into the hallways, now glowing red with warning lights. The entire ship felt like it was holding its breath. In a private chamber near the bridge, she showed him a hologram of the Rock John fleet, dozens of sharp, dark ships aligned in a hunting formation. They believe I have weakened our empire by accepting you. They think your presence is a sign of our collapse. David stared at the display. Then I've made things worse. No, she said. You've revealed the truth, that we must change or fall. She paused. I will go to the core forge. I will complete the vow, and you must be there. What if I fail? He asked. What if I say or do something wrong? Ira's voice dropped to a whisper. Then it is not failure. It is simply truth. And perhaps the truth is what we need. Before he could speak again, the ship jolted only slightly, but enough to make the lights flicker. The Rakjan were testing their defenses. Prepare yourself, she said. Tomorrow we descend to the forge, and the galaxy will watch. That night, David stood alone in his quarters, looking at the stars beyond the glass, wondering how one small gift had brought him here, wondering if it would be enough. He thought of Earth, of quiet evenings and carved wood, of simple things that meant more than anyone knew. And he began to understand that sometimes the smallest act could shake the stars. The morning of the renewal came not with light, but with silence so deep that David thought time itself had stopped. The vast halls of the Zilari vessel, wrapped in stillness as though the ship were holding its breath, waiting for a choice that could not be undone. The ceremonial guards met him outside his quarters, their armor dimmer than usual, their steps slow and careful, as if even their movement could disturb something sacred. And David, wrapped now in formal robes of deep silver and sky blue, felt the weight of every glance they gave him, knowing that he was no longer seen as just an outsider, but as a symbol, or worse, a spark that might set the empire on fire, whether by hope or chaos no one could say. The journey to the core forge began without fanfare, a quiet shuttle launch from the upper decks, taking them into the heart of the Zilari homeworld, a planet that shimmered like glass wrapped in clouds, its surface a maze of ancient towers and floating temples that rotated slowly in perfect balance, and at the center of it all stood the forge, a glowing chasm surrounded by spires that pulsed with energy drawn from the planet's core, where for generations the heirs of the empire had come to renew the vow of balance and purpose, though this time it was different. This time, the vow would not be made alone. As David stepped out beside Ira, the ground beneath their feet humming with ancient power, he saw the crowd gathered in the sky above, entire cities suspended in orbit, their lights watching like stars, and among them the ships of the Rock John loomed like wolves in the dark, ready to strike if they sensed weakness, or hesitation, or fear. Ishara turned to him once as they approached the heart of the forge, her voice steady, but her eyes shadowed by what she knew must come. When I speak, you must place your hand on the flame crystal and say your truth, no more, no less. The forge reads not your words, but your meaning. David nodded, unsure if he even understood his own meaning anymore, but he followed her down the long steps into the circle where the vow would be made, where the fire of the planet rose through clear stone and cast dancing lights on their faces, and where the silence became so complete that his heartbeat sounded like thunder. Ira stepped forward and began to speak in the ancient Zilari tongue. each word slow and careful, her voice echoing across the land and the sky, as if it were being carried by the wind itself. And then, when her vow was complete, she stepped aside and the forge flared brighter, a column of golden fire surging up through the platform, waiting for David. For a moment he stood frozen, the fire reflecting in his eyes, feeling the gaze of billions pressing down on him from every side. And in that moment he remembered the wooden rose, the sound of his knife carving through soft bark back on earth, the quiet peace he'd once known, and he stepped forward, placed his hand over the flame crystal. It was warm, not burning, and spoke in a voice that was almost too quiet to be heard. I gave what I had, and I meant it. The flame leapt higher, sudden and wild, swirling around him but never touching, and a great chime rang through the towers, deep and low like the heartbeat of the world. Ayara gasped softly beside him, and the crowd above shifted, light flickering, in a wave that moved from one city to another. For a few long seconds nothing happened, and then, without warning, the sky cracked with light, a shock wave of golden energy, surging from the forge in every direction, hitting the ships of the Rock Jun, and making them scatter like birds before a storm, their formations broken, their signals lost in the burst. Alarms began to ring across their fleet as their engines faltered. Their weapons refused to respond, and confusion spread through their command systems. Back in the forge the flame calmed, shrinking to a soft glow, and Ayara turned to David. Eyes wide, voice barely a whisper. You've awakened it. The core recognizes your truth. He opened his mouth to ask what that meant, but before he could speak, a new voice boomed through the air, coming from the sky itself, translated into every language. The vow has been witnessed by the ancient flame. The bond is real, and the age begins anew. Above them the crowds roared not just with approval, but with emotion, real and deep, something the Zilari had not felt together in many generations. But not everyone rejoiced, for in the outer rings of the empire, rebellion still stirred. And among the Rock Jun, a shadow figure watched through a cold lens, his eyes narrowing as he whispered to himself, "The human has changed the tide, but fire can burn both ways." Far below, as the sun finally rose over the edge of the Zilari world and lit the crystal towers with dawn, David stood beside Ayara in the center of the forge, feeling the warmth of something ancient now bound to him, not with chains but with choice. And though he didn't yet understand what would come next, he knew with sudden, strange certainty that the real test hadn't been the vow. It was what came after the flame had chosen. The silence after the fire faded was short-lived, because even though the people cheered and the sky seemed to sing, the shadows had only pulled back for a moment, not vanished. And David could feel it like a chill running along his skin, the sense that something deeper had been stirred by the flame, something old and dangerous that did not care about vows or unity or hope. As he and Ayara left the forge together, the ground still warm beneath their feet, they were met by her advisors with anxious faces and tight voices, speaking fast in their native tongue, warning that 3 outer colonies had gone dark, communications lost just after the burst from the core, and the Rock Jun ships, though scattered by the flame, had not withdrawn. They had regrouped farther out, gathering around a structure in deep space that none of the Zilari sensors had seen before, something massive and hidden until now. as if the fire of the vow had not only pushed the darkness back, but exposed what was hiding inside it. David listened as Ayara's top strategist, a narrow-faced woman named Kalari, explained that the object was not a ship, but a gate, and it had begun to activate moments after the renewal, somehow feeding off the same energy released by the forge, as though it had been waiting for this very spark to light it. The Xilari command argued in circles, fearful of moving too fast, but more fearful of doing nothing, while Ayara stood calm in the storm, her eyes on David as if waiting for him to speak, and when he finally did, his voice was quiet but firm. "We can't wait for them to strike. We take the stand now before the fear spreads." The room went silent, because the idea of an outsider making a call like that was unthinkable, but Ayara only nodded, and that was all that mattered. Within hours, the flagship Flame's Promise launched from the homeworld, carrying a fleet. Behind it, and one strange human at its heart, a man who had carved a wooden rose, and now stood at the edge of a war he barely understood, but one he could no longer turn away from. As they neared the anomaly, the stars bent around the structure huge, black, and alive with red light like veins beneath metal skin, and as the Alari ships formed a ring around it, trying to scan it without triggering a response, David and Ayara moved to the command deck where the tension was thick enough to choke on. They watched the sensors carefully, and then, suddenly, without warning, the gate pulsed once, and space tore open in its center like a wound, pouring out ships unlike any seen before, twisted, sharp, organic-looking things that moved like predators. Ignoring the fleet entirely as they headed straight for the flagship, the Xilari responded with calm precision, firing shields into place and launching defensive drones, but the enemy moved faster, smarter, dodging like they knew the playbook before it was written, and David watched in horror as one of the escort ships was sliced clean in half by a single strike. Alarms screamed and Kalari shouted orders, but nothing slowed the advance until Ayara turned to David, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You are the spark. This gate was waiting for you." Confused, he asked how that could be, and she replied, "Because the flame that chose you was not just light, it was a key. And the enemy fears what you've awakened." She grabbed his wrist and led him below deck to a chamber he'd never seen before, one filled with flowing crystal and ancient symbols, where a device rose from the floor like a pedestal, glowing with the same golden fire from the forge. "Place your hand there," she said, and when he did, the light surged around him, not burning but scanning, reading, remembering, and suddenly the ship shifted around them, lights brightening, weapons surging with new energy, and for the first time, the enemy paused in their attack, their ships circling but not closing, confused by what they sensed. Kalari's voice came through the comms. "They're hesitating. Something has changed." Ayara turned to David, her face set like stone, and said, "This is your stand. Use what they fear." Guided by instinct more than knowledge, David focused on the feeling he had when carving the rose, the quiet purpose of creation, the connection he'd felt to something bigger than himself, and the crystal responded, projecting waves of energy outward, not as a weapon, but as a presence. A voice that rang not in ears but in minds. Across the battlefield, the enemy faltered, some breaking formation, others pulling back, and the gate itself flickered like it was losing focus. But one massive ship pressed forward, blacker than the others, its surface shimmering with shifting shapes, and from it came a voice that filled the air around them. The flame has no place in the dark. Step back or be consumed. David stood firm, Ayara beside him, and replied aloud, "Then let the light speak for itself." He pressed his hand deeper into the crystal, and this time the energy flared out in beams, linking the Zilari ships together, boosting their systems, making them shine like stars. Together they moved as one, striking back with precision and force, not destroying but pushing, guiding the enemy away from the gate, until finally, with a sound like thunder cracking in space, the dark fleet withdrew, slipping back into the wind they came from, and the gate shuddered, dimmed, and closed, sealing itself with a sigh of spent power. Silence followed, and then cheers, weak at first, then stronger, as the fleet realized what had happened, not victory by war, but by presence, by will, by standing firm when fear said to run. Later, as the flames promised, drifted back toward the homeworld, Ayara stood beside David and looked out at the stars, her voice soft with wonder. They built that gate for conquest, but it was you they feared, not because you brought war, but because you reminded them what peace could do. And David, tired and changed, nodded slowly, knowing now that his simple gift had not only awakened a people, it had drawn out something terrible, and beaten it without fire, only with the spark of something far older. Meaning, when the battle ended and the stars returned to stillness, the silence felt heavier than the chaos had, and as the flames' promise glided back toward the Zilari homeworld, every corridor and chamber of the great ship seemed quieter, like the entire vessel held its breath, waiting for something unseen. David sat alone in the observation deck, watching the stars drift by, the golden fire of the forge now quiet inside him, but not gone, its warmth deep in his chest, like a heartbeat that no longer belonged to just him. And though the enemy had been pushed back, the weight of what he had awakened still pressed on his thoughts. Because now he understood something deeper. This was never about one battle, or one vow, or even one gift. This was about what came next, what grew in the shadow of light, and how long that light could last. Ayara joined him silently, her presence calm but tired, and together they stared into space for a long time without speaking, until finally she said, "The council wants answers. But more than that, they want to know what to do with you." David looked at her and asked, "What do you want to do with me?" And she smiled, just barely, and replied, "You gave something small, and it became something great. Perhaps it's time you understood what that means." Back on the surface of the Zilari capital, crowds filled the towers, the cities. The sky weighs more than just celebration. It was a moment of change, a breath between two eras, and when David stepped into the central dome with Ayara at his side, the roar of the people was almost too much to take. But they quieted as she raised her hand, speaking first not as a ruler, but as a daughter of their world, her voice echoing through crystal towers and floating cities. The flame chose not a warrior, not a king, but a human, one who gave what he had with no thought of return. Then she stepped back and motioned to David, and for the first time he stood before the galaxy, not as a visitor or a symbol, but as something more. He spoke simply, his words slow but clear. "I came from a small place with no power, no ships, no fire. I gave a gift because I believed it would matter. And somehow it did. The crowd was silent, not cold, but listening in a way that felt deeper than sound. And when he finished, there were no cheers, only stillness, like the planet itself was listening. Later that night, in the high halls of the council, voices rose in debate, some praising David as a symbol of a new future, others fearing what his presence meant for their ancient ways, and one voice, an elder with eyes like old stars, spoke above them all. It is not the gift that changed us. It is the heart behind it. The decision came not with votes or power, but with silence, and then a single agreement: David would stay, not as a ruler, not as a figurehead, but as something new, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of the flame, the first human guardian of the renewal. The title was old, forgotten by many, but now reborn, and with it came a duty to travel, to learn, to share, and to ensure that the light he sparked did not fade into history. Years passed like pages turning in a story, and David moved from world to world, guided by Iyara and the flame, his legend growing quietly, not through battles or speeches, but through small moments, restoring broken cities, calming angry leaders, giving hope where none remained, and always carving roses from wood, leaving them behind in places that needed them most. The enemy did not return, not yet, but their shadows lingered in whispers and rumors, and David knew they watched, waiting for weakness. But what they didn't understand was that strength did not come from ships or weapons. It came from meaning, from choice, and from people who chose to believe in something greater than fear. Many tried to follow him, some with good hearts, others with ambition, but none could carry the flame as he did, not because he was special, but because he never asked for it, he only honored it. And when the time came, many years later, as the stars turned and empires changed, David stood once more in the forge, older now, his hands lined, but his eyes still steady. Iyara stood beside him, her hair touched with silver, her gaze proud and quiet, and he placed a final wooden rose on the stone where his journey had begun. He turned to the crowd, new leaders, new voices, even new species among them, and said, "Legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we give forward." The flame rose once more, gentle and gold, wrapping around him like light from a dream, and then it faded, taking him with it, not gone, but carried into memory, into story, into the hearts of those who would one day make their own gifts, their own vows, their own stands. And so the spark lived on, not as a tale of war, but as a quiet truth that even in the coldest dark, a small light freely given could change the stars.